Hey, everybody. Welcome to Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement. As always, my name is Mike Horowitz. I am the faculty director here, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our last public event of the semester. Information age technologies are shaping how states gain leverage in the 21st century, and countries are also reshaping the way that they design their militaries. I mean, just to be honest about it, the most important country in the world besides the United States is China. And the most important region in the world is the Indo-Pacific. Sorry, that's my personal opinion, not an institutional Perry Worldhouse opinion. But and I can think of no better way in some ways to conclude our series of public events throughout the semester than with Perry Worldhouse faculty fellow Fiona Cunningham, who is here to discuss her book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security. Professor Cunningham is an assistant professor of political science here at Penn. She's affiliated with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Brown Center for International Politics. Super excited to hear her speak today in conversation with Dimitri Sevastopoulou, and I totally butchered your name, just as I promised I would. He is a legend in the journalistic study of U.S.-China relations and the Indo-Pacific. He covers it for the Financial Times. He previously served as Washington bureau chief, U.S. politics correspondent, Pentagon and CIA correspondent, Washington business correspondent, and a South China correspondent. He spent 4 years in Hong Kong running the Financial Times' Asia news operations, and he was a currency derivatives trader at Citibank in Tokyo. Since this is Penn, I presume all of you know exactly what a currency derivatives trader does, even though I know what all of those words mean, but not necessarily in combination. Anyway, we are super excited to have the two of them here for a tremendous conversation about Professor Cunningham's book. And with that, I will stop talking and yield the stage to you all.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure I knew what a currency derivatives trader was either, which is probably why I only lasted 1 year. So a pleasure to be with you all. I'm with Fiona. Thank you for inviting me. My kids always tell me don't start off with the joke, and I always ignore them. So I've just driven down from DC, where they say that globalization is now dead with the Trump administration. But you have an Australian woman with an Irish name, an Irish man with a Greek name, talking about Chinese nuclear policy in Pennsylvania. I think that's pretty good globalization. So delighted to be here. And the only other thing I'd say to Mike is, when you say the most important country in the world after the US is China, I think it's either Australia or Ireland, but we can debate that later. Anyway, we are here today to talk about Fiona's book, which is excellent. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it. I'm going to jump right in, Fiona. So you say earlier in the book that it's about China's search for leverage to cope with the limited war dilemma. So I'm going to ask you just to briefly kind of just get a little bit of a glossary out of the way so everyone understands the context. What is the limited war dilemma?
Great. So my microphone is on as well. I will also say that perhaps globalization is in no way dead when we're here in the Global Policy Lab at Penn, and it appears to be full with everyone who I assume is also representing many nations around the world. But thank you, Dimitri, and thank you to Mike. Thank you to Perry Worldhouse for the event. The limited war dilemma is one of the 3 big ideas in this book, and it is the puzzle that motivates the broader book. And the basic idea of the limited war dilemma is to capture this problem that all nuclear armed states face in the nuclear age if their adversaries also have nuclear weapons, which is how can you continue to use your military capabilities for coercion, to get leverage against your adversaries without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war. And this is a true dilemma. No country, no nuclear armed country, not even the United States, has managed to solve this dilemma. Rather, every country has tried to come up with different ways to cope with it because there's always a trade-off. So there are 2 sort of key ways that we might think of traditionally that countries cope with the limited war dilemma. One of them is a la Russia or Pakistan, which is simply threatening to use nuclear weapons first to generate coercive leverage and get your adversary to give in to your demands because they're too scared of a nuclear war to continue. The other option is that you can think a little bit more like the United States in the post-Cold War era, which is to rely on having conventional military capabilities that can threaten a decisive victory against your adversary. And you also have nuclear weapons, and so that's going to prevent your adversaries from trying to overturn your victories by escalating to the nuclear level. So they're the two kind of conventional ways of coping with the problem. But China hasn't done either of those two things. And so this tees up this problem of how did China cope with this limited war dilemma?
How did you know what my next question was going to be? So
in the
China
book.
has gone a different path from everyone else. Can you explain, what you call that path, and then why China decided at kind of a 30,000-foot level, and then we can jump into some of the different components of the book that you write about.
Definitely. So China's answer to this limited war dilemma, I argue, is distinctive from that which other nuclear armed states have selected, and I call it strategic substitution. So what is strategic substitution? At its core, it is threatening to use non-nuclear weapons that can have strategic effects. What are strategic effects? They are the ability to use military capabilities that are directly going to affect decision makers in the White House rather than affecting the choices of military commanders who might be sitting in Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii on the ground. So this is a kind of impact directly at the decision maker level. And pairing that use of these non-nuclear capabilities with a nuclear strategy that threatens to use nuclear weapons only if you were attacked with nuclear weapons first. And so what this combination of these provocative uses of non-nuclear weapons and a more defensive or retaliatory nuclear strategy does is to squeeze your adversary and dare them to be the one that is going to use nuclear weapons first. So you're able to increase the risk of nuclear escalation without actually having to be the one to use nuclear weapons first. So strategic substitution is not a silver bullet. I want to be really clear about this. This doesn't solve the limited war dilemma. It has the same kinds of advantages and disadvantages that many of the other options have. For example, you do nothing to diminish your adversary's ability to keep on fighting a conventional war, or also to escalate to the nuclear level in response to the use of these provocative non-nuclear attacks. I argue, though, that this option appealed to China because it saw serious disadvantages with the two more traditional options. In the post-Cold War era, it was very significantly inferior to the United States in conventional military capabilities for most of the last couple of decades. And its leaders, I think, had this very distinctive set of judgments about nuclear weapons where they simply didn't think it was going to be credible to threaten to use nuclear weapons first, and that your adversary would actually take that threat seriously. Couple that with the fact that when the Cold War ended, China's legacy capabilities for how it planned to fight wars during the Cold War didn't thumb the scales in favor of either having nuclear capabilities that could threaten first use or a conventional military that could threaten decisive victories. And these are the reasons why I think China both saw appeal in developing this strategic substitution option, but also didn't have a sort of foregone conclusion the way that some other countries might because of how it had planned to fight during the Cold War.
So I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes about the different components of strategic substitution and what China actually developed and why, to kind of dig a little bit more. But just explain a little bit more. So why did China not decide to kind of go more full throttle with the nuclear? I mean, yes, it would have taken more time. I assume it's more expensive. But everything they've done has taken time. So were there other reasons why they decided that the nuclear issue was not the one to push?
So the key reason that I identify in the book is really this credibility problem. So I document in one of the first empirical chapters of the book 3 debates that China's defense strategists and all the way up to the leadership level had about changes to their nuclear strategy, because of course China faced some serious challenges which I call leverage deficits, these crises over the Taiwan Strait in 1995-96. In 1999, for those of you who were alive at the time might remember, that the United States accidentally bombed China's embassy during the Kosovo Air War in Belgrade. China did not believe that this was an accident. It thought that it was intentional, even though the US pleaded until it was red in the face that it was indeed an accident. So China had these sort of opportunities to think about what it needed to do to gain more leverage against its adversaries. And at those times, it often had these quite vigorous debates about whether or not it actually needed to change its nuclear strategy, whether it needed to adopt a nuclear strategy that looked more like the Russians or the Pakistanis with tactical nuclear weapons, with a larger force structure. That debate took place in the early 90s. And later in the early 2000s, there was a vigorous debate over whether it needed to add conditions to its no first use policy, this long-standing pledge that China has had in place since it first tested a nuclear weapon in 1964, in which it promised that it would not use nuclear weapons unless it was first attacked by another country's nuclear weapons. And there was this debate of, well, if we are losing a conventional war, shouldn't we have, conditions that permit us to use nuclear weapons in that extreme circumstance? And those debates document pretty clearly on the other side. There were voices saying, look, if we change our nuclear strategy, we're going to generate a security dilemma in the region. Nuclear threats against an adversary are just not credible because once you start going down that road, you cannot control further escalation up to a catastrophic nuclear war. And so China saw advantages to investing in these other information age capabilities, the kind of pillars of strategic substitution. I'll mention them now for the sake of everyone to get a sort of grasp of what I'm talking about here.
I think you've read my questions, I think.
Counterspace weapons, offensive cyber operations, and its missile force. And I can talk more about what that actually looks like in terms of what China threatens to do. But all of these weapons are going to be less destructive than using nuclear weapons. And therefore, it helps to solve that credibility problem that China diagnosed with threatening nuclear weapons first use throughout the post-Cold War era.
So I have kind of 2 or 3 questions on that. So with the 3 weapon systems, so precision-guided missiles with conventional non-nuclear payloads, offensive cyber capabilities, and counter-space weapons, why did they choose those 3 in particular? Were there others they thought about and then discarded? And the one I'm really curious about is cyber, because when they started down this path, I mean, cyber was, for most people, really in its kind of elementary stages. So, and I'm in China, I remember being a student in Beijing in 1997, and we just got email. So it seems like cyber was an interesting one for them to embark on at that time.
So I think there is, I'll say 2 things about this. I think, first of all, there is a question of like, what is the class of weapons that China was looking to invest in? What are the characteristics of weapons that are going to be good non-nuclear substitutes for threatening nuclear first use or conventional victories? These are the traditional answers to the limited war dilemma. And so China was sort of looking in that band of capabilities. And there are 3 things that I think distinguish these capabilities that China chose that made them good weapons within that particular class. One is that they threaten to have large-scale effects against an adversary's society, its military, its allies that were difficult to defend against. A second is that they crossed what we often talk about as salient thresholds, these kind of important lines that are drawn around limited wars by adversaries when they don't want to have a full-scale general war. So things like increases in geography, crossing into new domains like the space domain that kind of violate those thresholds that otherwise might be trying to delimit a conflict in a more local space. The third key characteristic, and perhaps the most important one, is that China was looking for, I think, weapons that touched on nuclear weapons or their support capabilities. So if you think about counter-space weapons, offensive cyber operations, conventional missiles, all of them have a kind of technological connection with nuclear arsenals. They either deliver nuclear weapons in the case of missiles, or they can be used to attack that kind of supporting infrastructure that enables countries to use their nuclear weapons. So you rely on space for things like communications, warning, battle damage assessment. If you use nuclear weapons, you rely on information networks. And so if you have offensive cyber operations, it means you also potentially have the ability to compromise your adversaries' use of their nuclear weapons. So they create these kinds of escalatory pressures through their connections. On the other hand, though, offensive cyber operations, precision conventional missiles, and what have I missed? Counterspace. They are not the only options that China could have selected that could fit all of these characteristics. And they're certainly not the only things that China was sort of sniffing around at in the early 2000s, the late 1990s as possible substitutes. So other ones that I look at in the book are, why didn't China just build out a very large bomber force of aircraft that could deliver conventional munitions in the same way as missiles do, but you put them on an aircraft instead? And the reason that China didn't go down that road is pretty clear. In the late 1990s, their aircraft technology was just very backward compared to their missile capabilities. And so you have a kind of technological availability story that drives China to pick some of these weapons that sit in the class of potential substitutes, but not others. Another that comes out very clearly is in the 90s, there's a lot of writing in China about integrated, what they would call network and electronic warfare. So they were looking at kind of, cyber operations and electronic warfare as being a kind of, complementary capabilities. But in the end, they make decisions not to really view electronic warfare as having this strategic potential to influence decision makers in the same way as cyber operations might. And to answer your question about the why cyber, from the mid-1990s onwards, China's military researchers are looking at US interest in using what they called at the time computer virus warfare, which sounds kind of cute and quaint. But looking at how the US was thinking about this set of issues in the first Gulf War, they certainly watch what Serbian militias are doing during the Kosovo conflict to kind of create a nuisance through some of the cyber operations that they were conducting very early on against NATO servers. So they kind of, I guess, grasp onto the promise of this weapon of thinking, wow, this could have great psychological effects. It could paralyze these information-dependent advanced economies and militaries like the United States in ways that are cheap and highly effective. And so China kind of bought into the cyber hype. It didn't necessarily work out exactly as I think China thought this technology would, but it appears to have stuck with it up until now.
So would you say of the three different paths that they chose, the cyber was the least effective, or how did the other two do, the counterspace and the missiles?
So I think, if I were to rank them in terms of their effectiveness, I think that the conventional missiles, the conventional precision strike capabilities have been the most effective in generating leverage against the United States. I think that counterspace weapons have been very effective in peacetime in changing how the United States thinks about the kind of space architectures that it needs for them to be survivable, resilient in a conflict scenario. I think the cyber operations have been the least kind of dependable component of China's strategic substitution approach. And so to give you a little bit more context, back in about 2010, when up until I'd say roughly 2010, cyber operations sort of existed a little bit in the shadows, even in the United States. And at that point, you saw US defense officials come out and basically speak very vocally about the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor, this idea that you would have coordinated large-scale cyber attacks on US critical infrastructure that could have a kind of paralyzing effect, that could have these strategic effects on the White House, that maybe you would even think of these as the kind of nuclear weapon of the 21st century. Over time, though, I think US attitudes towards the potential for cyber operations has changed quite significantly. By 2017, US decision makers were describing a very different understanding of what the kind of key effect of cyber operations were. And there they were thinking, really the important thing that these capabilities can do is all at the kind of gray zone area. So this is between peacetime and a conflict, that they're kind of engaging in cyber operations that are going to steal data, that are going to cause disruptions, but none of these things are really going to rise to the level of equivalent to a kinetic conventional conflict. And so cyber operations are cumulatively death by 1,000 cuts rather than these massive sort of coordinated cyber attacks in the midst of a conflict. At the same time, China watched these debates occur in the US. The experts in China started to buy into some of these US concerns about, the true nature of cyber attacks being this, subconventional death by 1,000 cuts sort of idea. But the PLA, China's military, has continued to really not just believe in, but engage in preparations for large-scale cyber attacks against US critical infrastructure. If any of you have heard about the Volt Typhoon attacks, or I shouldn't say attacks, but intrusions on US and allied critical infrastructure, this is exactly the kind of script of campaigns that China has been talking about in its doctrinal writings about cyber operations really for like 2 or 3 decades. The big turning point, I think, has been for China's military is observing what's happened in Ukraine. And there they are seeing that Russia has tried to use cyber attacks as these kind of game-changing weapons early on in a conflict, and it hasn't worked. And so they are now kind of debating and asking this question of whether cyber operations, by their nature, just can't be used for these kind of big strategic effects on adversary decision makers, or whether the Russians just did it badly.
Or the Americans and the British are quietly in the background providing
Exactly.
a little bit of support to the Ukrainians.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. Roughly when did China embark on this course? I mean, you talked about the Taiwan Straits crisis, 95, 96. Was it immediately after that, or at what point did they decide to go the strategic substitution route?
So I think that the strategic substitution option for China emerges gradually between, roughly speaking, 1995 and about 2002. So in that sort of late period of the 1990s, when there were a series of pretty intense US-China crises. It's also the time when the US supported China joining the WTO. So it wasn't all, tensions. There was quite a lot of complexity to the relationship. But nevertheless, the big watershed for China that pushes it to really think carefully about strategic deterrence is the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. Up until that point, China knew that a Taiwan contingency in which Taiwan sought further independence was one possibility for a conflict for the kind of what the Chinese military described as local wars under high technology conditions. This was one of the local wars that they were thinking about preparing for in the post-Cold War era, but it became the conflict that China was preparing for in the post-Cold War era after that 95-96 Taiwan Straits crisis. And largely because at that point, China became certain that they needed to plan for that war as if the United States was going to intervene. Mm-hmm. And this isn't just the United States. For China in 1995, this is the country with the most powerful conventional and nuclear forces on the planet. And they realized at that point that they had a leverage deficit. They lacked the ability to create a conflict or create a situation in which that conflict would be too dangerous and too risky for the US to intervene. And so that's the kind of kernel, if you like, of strategic substitution, is the search China then embarks on after that crisis to look for alternatives to the nuclear and the conventional options that for various reasons are not palatable for them. The first of those capabilities is the conventional missile force that just by happenstance China had kind of lying around. It's tested and experimented with those capabilities in the Taiwan Straits crisis because it conducted these missile tests into the kind of waters around Taiwan and discovered that this actually was a pretty successful way, they thought, of putting pressure on Taiwan and putting pressure on the United States. And so they then rolled out a much more extensive coercive missile force posture after that crisis. It's then the Belgrade embassy bombing that pushes China to recognize it's got another leverage deficit, a deeper one that it had actually realized, and it needs more of those capabilities. So in the course of meetings, trying to think about how they would fill that gap after the Belgrade embassy bombing, China settles on the cyber option and the counterspace option, roughly speaking, in the period of 2000 to 2002. And after that, they go and build the capabilities, and we end up more or less where we are today.
So if it started in that time period, 95 to 2002, you've basically had, in terms of Chinese leaders, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. Has there been any difference in how China has approached this through the three leaders, or has it been fairly consistent?
I think that the big difference in how China has approached strategic substitution, well, I will note two things. One is that I think that China's approach to how it actually implemented coercion using these information age weapons changed over time. Part of it is because of technological change. So, for example, with the missile force, up until about 2013 or so, China's missiles were simply too inaccurate for it to really think about threatening escalation as being like a ladder that it could carefully control. Instead, it became more like a slippery slope that China would sort of send both countries down, and you sort of see what happens when you end up at a heap at the bottom of that, you know, may or may not be pretty close to a nuclear war.
Yeah.
So China's technology constraints are one thing that changes that has a little bit less to do with the leadership piece. But there are also questions of China's own vulnerability that changes. So China, any of you who went to China in the early 2000s and has gone more recently knows that this country basically like runs on the internet to a much greater degree than I think we do here in the United States. So China's digitized dramatically in that period of time. And that means China is now much more vulnerable to offensive cyber operations than it used to be. And so that means that it needed to rethink how careful it was about engaging in cyber operations, because it was going to have to deal with blowback, potentially in the form of offensive cyber operations against its critical infrastructure. Not a problem in 2000. By 2010, it's a huge problem. And so you see the leaders sort of dealing with that issue. The final thing I will just note there is that I think around 2012, 2013, when Xi Jinping comes into office, he's quite attentive to the problem of crisis management. And so there is a sort of review, if you like, of the counterspace and cyber operations postures during that time, where Xi Jinping is more attuned to how you actually sort of manage and control crisis escalation that spills over into thinking about how you actually use these capabilities as well. The big change, though, might be how she thinks about nuclear weapons.
Well, you definitely see my questions. So I'm going to fast forward to today. So, you know, when they started on this path, they didn't have a very expansive nuclear capability. They didn't think that the nuclear coercion would work because people wouldn't take it seriously. Over the last 5 or 6 years, they've dramatically expanded their nuclear arsenal. The Pentagon predicts or forecasts that they will have as many nuclear warheads in 2035 as the US and Russia have deployed. It's about 1,500. So they're getting close. If that's true, they're getting close to parity, at least in terms of deployed weapons. If that's the case, do they still need strategic substitution, or do you think that they will veer away from that because the nuclear coercive threat will be so large they won't need other things?
So I've watched the Chinese nuclear modernization obviously very carefully for signs that this was a shift away from strategic substitution, because that would be, you know, a sign that China had basically said, actually, we don't think that the nuclear first use or the nuclear coercion option is that bad in the end. And we're going to go more kind of Russia or Pakistan in how we think about gaining leverage than initially had been the case. But I think even just purely looking at Chinese capabilities, size alone doesn't give you good first use options for coercing an adversary. I think a lot of the nuclear literature suggests that you need to posture your capabilities very carefully to make these threats of nuclear first use credible. So what I would expect to see for China is for it to abandon its no first use pledge, which it hasn't done. For it to develop clear signs of doctrine for the first use of nuclear weapons. I would expect it to put nuclear warheads on some of its shortest range missiles, so it would have the most kind of, or the least destructive nuclear weapons available in its arsenal, because then they're much easier to use. If they're the least destructive, you can kind of imagine a world in which you use these first, and you can sort of try and conclude a nuclear exchange before you end up busting each other's cities with multi-megaton warheads.
They haven't done that yet, is that correct?
They, to my knowledge, they have not done that according to any of the publicly available reporting. So China still hasn't done some really important things that I would expect to see if it really wanted to squeeze all of that coercive leverage out of its nuclear capability. So that's kind of one piece that I'm watching. The other, I think, key piece here is that we don't see, and I mean, admittedly, evidence is thin on the ground about China's decision makers' views of nuclear weapons, but we don't see a reversal in China's expert community of this assessment that nuclear threats are not necessarily going to be credible in a conflict against an adversary that's like the United States. I'd expect to see some changes in those assessments of credibility if China was shifting towards this first use option. So there's some of the sort of pieces that I'm looking for. The final question I'd be looking for is clear evidence that strategic substitution had lost the confidence of China's leaders. And I've pointed, I think, to some things that make China a little bit nervous about the cyber option, but the space and the conventional missile options, I think, are two things that China continues to see as sources of pretty significant coercive leverage against the United States, and one that certainly, I think, in the missile case, the US hasn't come up with good options to. I think the United States has taken some options in the space domain to try and blunt the leverage that China has been gaining through deployment and development of counterspace capabilities. But China sees, I think, more risks in that area, but not necessarily a loss of leverage. So they're the kind of reasons why, looking at the broader picture of China's strategic deterrence posture, I'm a little bit less certain than some that China is shifting its nuclear posture, and this is kind of the death knell of strategic substitution.
Can I just ask you, just, I mean, with cyber and with conventional missiles, it's probably a little bit easier to imagine what that is. Just give us a few examples of what are counterspace capabilities.
So if anybody remembers, and I remember this very clearly because this is one of the kind of entrees into this topic for me when I was a college student. In 2007, China tested an anti-satellite weapon, which was basically a missile on the ground that it shot into space and destroyed one of its aging weather satellites that was circulating the globe in low Earth orbit. So that's like your most, I guess, anchoring and most rudimentary of counterspace capabilities, but it can also involve what we call co-orbital counterspace capabilities. So this is other satellites or objects that are in space that can be used to approach and harass, collide with, otherwise interfere with an adversary satellite. So you can jam their signals, you can use lasers to damage or temporarily disrupt their optical sensors. So you have that kind of option as well. The final sort of piece of this is that you have ground-based, what we call non-kinetic anti-satellite weapons, which is the ability to jam satellite signals from the ground. So that's a kind of sort of the suite. They sound, very futuristic, but they actually were developed during the Cold War. So,
and then you have that incident where one satellite went from one orbit to another and snatched or grabbed.
Yep, China had a satellite that basically grappled a defunct satellite and towed it out of one of the active orbits in geosynchronous orbit into what we call a graveyard orbit, so it was not going to create problems for or take up space when it was not functioning. But you can imagine what happens if you do that to your enemy's satellite in the midst of a conflict.
So I want to ask a couple of questions about Taiwan, and then I'm going to open it up. I have a million more questions, but I want to make sure everyone in the audience who has a question can ask one. And if you're shy and you run out, I have plenty more. But two on Taiwan. One, just broadly speaking, how do you think these information age weapons apply in the case of a potential Taiwan conflict? And in terms of events that caused the Chinese planners to go down this route, did the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan in 2022 did it trigger anything in the way that some of these earlier events like the Taiwan Straits crisis did?
So I'll start with the Pelosi visit. To me, now with 2 years of hindsight that I didn't have when I was finishing this book, it doesn't look to me like the Pelosi visit generated what I call a leverage deficit that had an analogous impact on Chinese decision making that the Belgrade embassy bombing or the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1995-96 did on the capability development. In other words, it appears that China didn't look at its capabilities and say, we need more things to make Americans feel unsafe so that they don't do this again. It appears that China was somewhat satisfied with the capabilities that it currently has, even though it was deeply, deeply dissatisfied with the fact that Speaker Pelosi visited the island of Taiwan. It did exercise some of these information age weapons in the course of the PLA exercises that occurred after Pelosi's visit that kind of simulated encirclement of the island. It tested its precision conventional missiles. There were reports of some more nuisance-y kind of cyber attacks, like you had, things showing up on digital billboards on Taiwan that was sort of smearing Nancy Pelosi. There were questions about, I think, disruptions to operations at one of the major airports, if memory serves me correctly. No reports, though, of any counterspace activity at the time, to my knowledge. So China looks like it kind of tested a couple of these things out, but largely was sort of simulating this encirclement, sometimes with the aircraft and naval capabilities as well. But I think if you actually did see a conflict over Taiwan, a couple of things that I would just note from my research that may or may not give you cause for comfort. But I think it suggests that if the United States does intervene in any conflict between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, we should expect that that is not going to stay in the region around Taiwan. It is going to involve attacks on U.S. bases in the region using some of China's conventional missiles. That's pretty clear in their doctrine, and it's pretty clear that that is a signaling capability even before you end up in an actual conflict, as well as playing an important role in the conflict itself in generating these costs for the U.S. and coercive pressure on Washington. We should expect to see offensive cyber operations occur on the continental United States, on allied territory as well. Whether they actually work or not, though, is, I think, a huge open question. And it is always, I think, with these kinds of cyber operations. And I think we should expect to see at least some conflictual activity occurring in space as well, with some of, certainly, I think, those non-kinetic counter space operations that I described. I think another important point here, though, is that these capabilities also enable China to put pressure on Taiwan itself directly. Yeah. The calculation there, though, is a little bit different because it's just straight up coercion. There's no Taiwanese independent nuclear capability that means that there is this limited war dilemma that creates challenges for how China, or rather how much pressure China might put on Taiwan as opposed to the United States, because it does not have to worry about that conflict with Taiwan itself going nuclear. It has to worry about directing that pressure and that care, if you like, of avoiding nuclear war with the US.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So open to the floor. Who would like to, gentlemen?
Want to ask?
Oh, sorry. Can you go up to the microphone there? Sorry.
I want to ask about the impact of China's expansion of their Navy and what's going on in the Spratly Islands and how that's going to affect all this.
So it's a slightly different problem set. We'll just emphasize. China uses the information age weapons that I have been describing for, I'd say, primarily for strategic deterrence, so for generating these coercive pressures against the United States. But they also play a warfighting role in sections of, other campaigns that China might conduct that exist at much, much, much lower levels of the escalation ladder. And I would argue that that's where anything that is occurring in the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, the Diaoyu Senkaku, and the territorial disputes with Japan, These capabilities, have sort of applications, if you like, in those lower level conflicts and putting pressure directly on some of the US's allies in those points. But I would argue that it doesn't quite sort of rise to the level of the strategic deterrence implications of these capabilities unless those conflicts blow up in ways that are very unpredictable. I think the other thing that's really worth emphasizing, though, is that obviously China's other conventional military capabilities have not stood still. What's being substituted in strategic substitution is a theory of victory of nuclear, conventional, or using these kinds of provocative non-nuclear capabilities. It does not preclude China, obviously, from building up its conventional military capabilities that could create options for it to rely much more on those conventional capabilities. Excuse me, on the conventional sort of answer to the limited war dilemma in the future. And certainly it's been building up its naval capabilities to pursue its objectives against other regional territorial claimants. But they, I think, operate according to a slightly different logic of coercion and war fighting than what this kind of layer is all about.
Who else has a gentleman in the very back? So you're going to get exercise running around. Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks.
My question goes to why the change from strategic substitution to a focus more on nuclear weapons? Was there something inherent in Xi Jinping's background that he wanted to make that change? What accounts for that shift?
So thank you for the question. I would just to be clear, I do not think that China is abandoning strategic substitution because it has been building up its nuclear capabilities. That said, it is very clear that China recently has placed a lot more emphasis on building up its nuclear capabilities. I have an active research agenda that's examining why China has built up its nuclear capabilities. And I think Dimitri sort of laid it out, but I think it's worthwhile emphasizing again growth in the size. China, I think, has now doubled its nuclear weapons arsenal in the last 5 years. It now fields much more accurate nuclear capabilities that enable it to limit the damage from actually conducting nuclear strikes. They are kept at a much higher state of readiness to launch. And it is also fielding a much more diverse nuclear force. So it's got a triad now. I'd say roughly 10 years ago, you could only say that China really had one leg of its nuclear delivery forces rather than all three like the United States. The research that I've been doing thus far suggests that there is not one reason, but multiple reasons why China has been engaging in this nuclear buildup. One of them is because US capabilities that could threaten China's nuclear forces have not stood still. They've improved, and China's strategists want to maintain the same level of deterrence that they previously had, but they also want a much greater margin for error. So that's one reason. A second reason that I think is a real shift in China's thinking about nuclear weapons is that it is seeking political leverage from its nuclear weapons. So what's the difference between political leverage and coercive leverage? The political leverage that China is seeking from its nuclear weapons is a kind of more is better, fairly rudimentary attitude towards nuclear weapons, that if we have a larger arsenal, it's going to make the US behave less recklessly, less capriciously in a Taiwan contingency. And here, these are their words, not mine, right? Just to be absolutely clear. But this isn't connected to any way that China's larger and more sophisticated nuclear force is going to enable it to perform better in either a nuclear war or a conventional war. It's disconnected from kind of military planning. It's all about the kind of psychological effect, if you like, of having more. In addition to that, I think there's some evidence that Xi Jinping is attentive to the lessons of history, and that looking back at the late Cold War suggests that he cares both about ensuring that China has a robust and adequate nuclear deterrent, but also that it doesn't overspend on arms so that the Chinese people don't have anything to eat. The final reason that I'm uncovering is a sort of among China's rocket force, which is where I would expect to see the strongest interest in a major shift in nuclear posture. They don't openly advocate for abandoning China's current nuclear posture. They don't openly call for abandoning its no first use policy, quite the contrary. But they do have these sort of vague and ambiguous discussions or comments about using nuclear weapons to help China achieve its objectives in conventional conflict. And I think you see this in the work of Tong Zhao at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as well, sort of talks about these ambiguous statements that you see from the rocket force. So that's what I see as driving China's nuclear modernization. It's a different problem set from strategic substitution, though. So I hope that helps you.
The vague statements on the rocket forces, that's in recent years?
In
Or?
recent years,
Okay,
yeah.
so-
I would say roughly speaking in about the last 7 years or so.
Okay, interesting. Who else in the front there?
Hi, Professor Cunningham. Good to see you again. My question is, especially as we move forward in kind of this information age weapons, as China continues to increase this, I believe for the next few years to come, how do you see this shaping global norms, especially how other states see the technologies and like in terms of like using them and implementing them and learning from China in terms of like international security?
Thank you. Nice to see you as well. I think there are a couple of opportunities for shaping norms. The first one I would suggest is that I think China's choices are in many ways intended to strengthen what we call the nuclear taboo with strategic substitution, but that cuts against its choices to modernize its nuclear arsenal that I would argue probably weaken that taboo. So there's a kind of contradictory effect on the norms surrounding nuclear weapons use. Other than that, I think with these other technologies, part of China's strategy, certainly in space and in the cyber domain, has been to engage through some of the multilateral processes that discuss what are appropriate uses of these capabilities. There was some very hard won diplomatic consensus in the cyber domain in, I think, about 2015 and again in 2017, discussing just some like rudimentary norms of what is appropriate behavior in cyberspace that China was involved in and that supports some of the ways that it thinks about using these capabilities in more controlled and more easily signaled manners. So if you think of escalation in these domains more like climbing a ladder rather than running down a slippery slope where everyone loses control of everything, being clear about where your red lines are and what behavior you consider to be provocative and unacceptable, a really important part of that involves having these discussions about where those red lines should be and should be agreed upon. There is another set of discussions, I think, occurring with regards to space right now in UN contexts. But my understanding is they're much more split. So there is a process that's led by the UK, has US buy-in that's about sort of strengthening norms of appropriate behavior in space. And then there is a competing process supported by Russia and China that is about a process to ban weapons placed in space. And so you have these dueling efforts, if you like, to define the norms that are occurring in this domain. So you see, even as part of the postures or the capabilities themselves, China's efforts in some instances to shape the norms of what is and isn't appropriate behavior. The final thing that I'll just say is that one of the most common questions that I'm asked by audiences about this book, especially in the context that we currently find ourselves, is what can US allies, do if they're thinking about, existing under a US nuclear umbrella where they can't be quite as confident perhaps that the US is going to come to their assistance, especially in a conflict that is going nuclear. Often the response to that is to say, well, allies can consider acquiring their own nuclear weapons. This set of capabilities sets, I think, another type of options or precedent, an example for the US's allies to think about ways to get leverage against common adversaries without having to think about crossing the nuclear threshold themselves.
And actually, Japan, I was talking to some Japanese politicians yesterday, are now debating how they can have more offensive cyber capabilities for that reason, right? Who's next? We have, well, just behind and then in the front row.
Is there any hope for peaceful coexistence within the next 50 years?
Next.
So I think that China remains committed to its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So in that rhetorical sense, I don't think we're moving away from that sort of a piece of things. But in all seriousness, I mean, just stepping back to the extent that you think that effective deterrence prevents the outbreak of conflict, having some of these options there may help the US and China both look at the prospects for conflict and think, this looks really bad. Maybe if we have a crisis, we want to think about ways in which to manage it instead. The second thing I will also add is that China's efforts to think about all of these information age weapons through a more controlled manner, as I suggested, had happened since the Xi Jinping era. It does create incentives for China to actually have more discussions with the United States about crisis management, about what China likes to call conflict prevention rather than crisis management. How do you stop a conflict from occurring in the first place? But I'd note that those conversations are deeply tethered to the political tenor of the relationship. If things are going badly at the broader US-China relationship, if the top officials are yelling at each other as they were in Alaska early on in the last administration, or fighting over a trade war, the prospects of having conversations about managing the military aspects of the relationship become much lower. So I think it just remains to be seen right now how much the trade tensions are going to spill over into broader efforts to manage this military relationship responsibly.
And isn't it fair to say that in terms of nuclear stability talks, there really has been nothing serious ever or in recent?
So I think that there are probably 2 official discussions that I'm aware. Well, I would say 2 dedicated official discussions. I think back in the mid 2000s, and because the book goes back that far, it's within the lifespan of it. But I think around 2006 or 7, there was a one single direct discussion between members of China's military, especially its rocket force, and the United States about nuclear matters. It was never repeated, and I think it was a one-way street where I think the US was probably doing more of the talking than China. And then the other big, I think, official discussion happened in November of 2023, if memory serves me correctly, where the Arms Control Division of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs had a direct discussion with the State Department counterparts. My understanding is that the nature of those conversations did not necessarily focus on managing the US-China relationship. They did generate a set of proposals that the US put forward that the US and China could discuss. Things like preventing a conflict in the first place by advancing some of the military-to-military discussions, notification of any ballistic missile or space launches, so that if, as I think some scholars pointed out, during the Ukraine war, the US and Russia both did routine tests of intercontinental range ballistic missiles. They both knew not to worry about them, though, because they notified each other and they had mechanisms to do so. So that was another proposal that was put on the table. And finally, a declaration between the US and China that a human would always make a decision to launch a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, there was actually tacit progress on some of those measures, I think, last year, even though the conversations, the direct discussions ended when the United States was selling arms to Taiwan. Perhaps the fact that this was one of the first things to go in response to that arms sales package suggests it was not as valuable to China as we might like to think it is. But nevertheless, because you had, for example, in September of last year, China, I think it was September, conducted an intercontinental range ballistic missile launch into the Pacific. They notified the United States of that launch beforehand. The US did a reciprocal launch notification before it did one of its tests. that is unprecedented in this relationship. So in the course of I think what is a very complicated and tense relationship, we still saw incremental progress, even without the kind of fully fledged bilateral discussions that we would perhaps like to see to let us all sleep at night a little bit better about the risks in the relationship.
I remember in 2005, I went as a journalist with Donald Rumsfeld to China, and he and his team visited now Rocket Forces, but then it was called Second Artillery. And they were super excited. First time an American defense secretary was going to get in there. And that evening we met up again, and the journalist said, "How was it?" And he said, "We got a PowerPoint briefing in the lobby." And that was it. So we've come a little bit away from that, but okay. So you had a question as well.
I don't think my question's well thought out, but is it a fourth pillar of the strategic substitution? China plays the long game always. Intertwining of economic systems. Our economy is so tightly tied to China, and China's is so tightly tied to ours. Is that an element in this, or is it just a complicating factor?
So I think that the economic entanglement factor, it's sort of part of a different problem set, if you like. I think that the strategic substitution approach is very much about like what happens when you are thinking about using force and having a full-blown US-China war over something as important as the Taiwan scenario. The economic entanglement obviously is a very important sort of part of the relationship. It bears on these issues of the military to military relationship, and whether you can have discussions about some of the strategic deterrence considerations at all, because it affects the broader political tenor of the relationship. But it is not, I would say, if I think to like what's the category or what are the criteria for potential weapons of strategic substitution, it's like large scale effects on an adversary's military, society, or allies that's difficult to defend against, crosses salient thresholds in a limited conflict, and is potentially entangled with nuclear forces. And I think of kind of, even something like misinformation or disinformation, which is another, I think, real irritant in the relationship between the US and China. It's more of a peacetime tool. By the time that you end up in a shooting war, that economic entanglement, I mean, I don't think that the US is going to care as much about taking a few economic hits from China if it's engaged in a conflict where nuclear weapons use is contemplated. So I think we're in a different world by the time that we're thinking about using these capabilities, that hopefully the economic relationship, may be one pillar that stops us from getting there.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. Gentleman back there in the middle.
Do you think that Xi Jinping ever imagines in his intimate private moments, I wish to heck that whole Taiwan issue were not present? Because when I think of the tremendous gains that China has made in all respects, if you can imagine that issue not to be present, I mean, it's like a tumor on one's body that's, let's say, not malignant, but unwelcome. And if one were to imagine that problem not existing, let's say there was never an island there at all, I would think that for someone like Xi Jinping, he'd be able to look at himself and his overall level of aggravation as being relatively not too terrible. I mean, China has not been kept from being great by the presence of that little tumor. Do you think he ever just wishes it would just be able to be removed, deleted? And then what would, if he's still thinking in his own mind, what would I then be in terms of my presentation to the Chinese people and to the world?
Dimitri, have you ever had the privilege of interviewing Xi Jinping?
I have not.
Okay, so I think anybody who works on, reports on, touches on anything to do with China would love nothing more than to know exactly what it is that Xi Jinping is thinking, or at least to hear what he would have to say about what he is thinking, even if that's not necessarily an accurate representation of what he's feeling. We don't have access to Xi Jinping's, inner thoughts, or even, I think, what he would say in response to some of these questions. So we can only ever speculate about what China's leaders might think about this set of issues. And my sense from reading the speeches that Xi Jinping delivers, which he may not, I admit, have written, that the Taiwan issue is not something I think any Chinese leader wants to wish away. I think that this is a deeply emotional and sui generis issue almost in Chinese politics today, because it's the unfinished business of the Communist Party's victory over the Republican forces in the Chinese Civil War. And so if you look at the speeches and how China talks about this issue, this is not something that they want to wish away. It is something that they want to resolve, and that is, one of the most deeply committed issues in the relationship. I will also emphasize, though, that I think even if you put aside the Taiwan issue, there are still a lot of reasons why China would need a strong military. It still has plenty of unresolved territorial disputes. It has Chinese citizens who are scattered all over the globe. It has global interests. It has infrastructure abroad that it wants to defend. And so this is not the only reason that China needs a strong military. But I don't think that this is an issue that China's leaders simply wish to forget.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Fiona. And to everyone who hasn't read the book yet, it's a really great read. It's fascinating. So I encourage everyone to dig in. And thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Dimitri, for yours.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to the last public event of the semester for Perry Worldhouse. We really appreciate it. We will obviously have a whole range of excellent programming next year. And join me in giving a round of applause one more time to our speaker and moderator.